So the fighting has been going on since 1914, and the U.S. joins in 1917 and really gives an advantage to the Allies. And in the end, they are able to help the Allies to defeat these Central Powers. And in 1918, Germany is basically forced to sign a truce with the Allies. So this happens at a conference called the Paris Peace Conference that happens in Paris. In fact, they sign the treaty in the Palace of Versailles, which we learned about when we talked about Louis XIV, who built this lavish, huge, beautiful palace and spent all of his country's money on it. So at this conference during World War I, the major powers involved all meet to basically come up with an agreement, a settlement, to end the war. So part of this is they have to decide how are they going to divide up the territories that were being fought over, the money that was involved, who's going to get the blame, all of those things. So the interesting thing here is that Germany and Russia are not present at this meeting. They are not invited, right? Why do you think that is? If you guessed that it's because they lost, then you're partially correct. So Germany, remember, was on the side of the Central Powers who lose the war, right? They lose to the Allies. So they're not invited, and that's a snub to them. But Russia is actually not present because Russia exited the war in 1917, and they were dealing with their own internal conflict, and they were going through an event that we'll learn about later called the Russian Revolution. So in the middle of World War I, Russia exits the war because they are going through a civil war back home. So who is at the conference? Well, there are representatives from the Allied powers. So we have for England, we had David Lloyd George was their advocate. And his main goal was that he wanted to punish Germany. He saw Germany as the main aggressor, and he wanted them to pay for what they did. David Lloyd George really wanted to accomplish this by making Germany give up its colonies and disbanding its navy, because the German navy was one of the worst groups to fight against during the war. They were one of the most powerful groups. The Unterseeboots, U-boats, submarines, were the ones that did the most damage. And then France was also represented by Georges Clemenceau. And France really had a unique part because they were the location of most of the fighting, happened in France. And so they suffered the most destruction and death in the war of civilians and destruction of their homes and buildings. And this is, for example, the main street of a large city in France in 1916 after it was destroyed. So Clemenceau's main focus is he wants reparations, right? So he wants there to be payment for the damage that was done. He wants Germany to pay for what they did, literally. But he also wants them to pay figuratively, and he wants them to pay figuratively in the sense that he wants Germany to lose power. He wants it to be broken up so that it cannot be so strong and do this again to anyone else. And then, of course, the Americans are represented here by the president at the time, who was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson comes in, and he's got this elaborate plan that he's come up with called the 14 Points. And basically, his goal is to set up an organization that has the goal of keeping peace. And so he proposes a lot of ideas in the 14 points, one of which is this idea of self-determination. So allowing people to decide what kind of government they want to have, instead of trying to force them to have certain types of government. And so by giving that freedom, he's hoping to preserve peace. And the organization that he wants to set up is what he calls the League of Nations. And so this would be an international organization, so with representatives from all different countries, and their main goal is to maintain world peace. And the irony is that the United States did not actually join the League of Nations, that their own president proposed and suggested. They didn't want to get involved. And the big reason for that, one of the big reasons for that, is that they saw what happened getting involved in a European conflict, and they were like, we really don't want to get involved in world affairs again. We got pulled into this world war, and look at all the men we lost, and all the, our sons and our brothers and our husbands were killed. So they don't want to be a part of that. So they choose to stay out of it. And then Germany and Russia are not given seats at the table. They're not invited to join the League of Nations. So it's kind of problematic, right? You see this idea that, oh, we're going to promote world peace, but you're not invited, Germany, and you're not invited, Russia. So they're already excluding people, and they're really harping on Germany, right? So Germany obviously is going to have some feelings about this. So one of the biggest things that happens at this meeting is they sign the Treaty of Versailles, which is a peace treaty that ends the war officially, and it puts all of these agreements in writing. And the most famous part of this treaty is called the War Guilt Clause, and it's found in Article 231 of the treaty. This is basically where it is put in writing that Germany has to accept full responsibility for World War I. And remember, we talked about how all of these different major players in the war had a role in starting it, according to our author that we were reading. And so it seems a little bit maybe naive, maybe overly simplifying things to put all the blame on one aggressor, which is Germany. And not saying that Germany wasn't guilty, but they certainly weren't the only ones. So as a result of this, that Germany has to accept all the blame, they're also forced to pay 6.6 billion pounds in reparations, and that is a lot of money. It's so much that it comes to about $55 billion, right? And it just crushes them, like you see in this picture. It is too much to the point that they just can't pay it. But it's seen as the amount appropriate due to all the damage that was done and all the losses that the Allies incurred. They also have to give up a lot of their territories, their colonies. So they give up a lot of their land. They lose 70,000 square kilometers of land, which is about 13% of what was part of Germany at the time. And that means that 6 million people that were living in German territory now no longer lived in Germany. Their territory was now being handed over to the Allies. And the last thing was that they had to demilitarize, and that means they had to disband their military. And that's a huge blow, because if you take away their military, what you're basically doing is, I think of it like if Germany were a lion, we're declawing the lion and we're making it defenseless. It cannot protect itself. And that lion is not going to roll over and play nice, right? It's not going to be happy about it. So obviously Germany is not at all happy with this, and it's so overwhelming and so harsh that they just are completely crippled politically and militarily and financially, to the point that it's going to put Germany in the hole for quite a long time, and they're going to suffer very badly. So this is one of the biggest effects of World War I that is really important to note, because this is really how we get from World War I to World War II. Because first of all, it creates this sense of chaos in Germany, that everything is suddenly just terrible. They're in a depression financially. Money becomes so worthless that you see here kids are building bricks out of paper money. Can you imagine if these were all $20 bills? Like, that's crazy. But they were that worthless that people were using them to burn fires and paper their walls and all kinds of stuff. And that makes Germans very bitter, and they feel like the world hates them, and so they're going to hate the world right back. So it's not really helping the goal of world peace. One thing that's important to note about the way that Germany is just thrown into this chaos and this bitterness and all the anger that must be festering there is that that really set the stage for a person like Adolf Hitler, who was a very charismatic leader, to step in and act as if he's going to save Germany from the world and from devastation. He's going to bring them out of this financial crisis. And he really, a lot of people ask that question, how on earth could they have let someone like Adolf Hitler become their leader? And the answer is that the conditions in Germany they were in a place that they were desperate and things were really tough and really bad, and he came in and made promises that he would fix those things, and he followed through on some of those promises and really did improve the economy of Germany. And so he was able to gain power more easily because of the effects of World War I. Another major effect of the Great War is that we saw a lot of territories changing, country, the lines of nation states are changing, borders are changing. So Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia all become independent nations, and all these new colonies that become mandates gain their own territories. So we see a lot of shifting of political boundaries. So for example, if you look on the left here, this is what Europe looked like before World War I. Notice Austria-Hungary is a large territory. And then when you look over here to the second map, this is Europe after World War I. So some of the big changes here, you see Austria-Hungary gets split up. We've got Yugoslavia is absorbing some of that. We've got the Ottoman Empire collapses and no longer exists, so this becomes Turkey. We see Poland is new, right? So Poland is going to be a major part of World War II. And we'll see how that plays into World War II. So a lot of political boundaries are shifting as well, which is going to shift the power in the world, as we know. Like I said, in Russia, during the middle of World War I, really towards the end of World War I in 1917, the Russians actually exited the war. They had their own issues going on at home. And really what was going on that made Russia have to drop out of World War I and focus on their own problems was that they had an internal revolution. The Russian Revolution happens. And as a result of this, communism becomes a major part of their government. They overthrow the Tsar, who had been part of a family that had been ruling over Russia for hundreds of years. And now they set up a communist government. And part of that was because as we said earlier, during wartime, the government has to take greater control over the economy. And so communism is an economic system that allows them to do that. So that is really a part of why this revolution was successful in establishing a communist government. In Western Europe, it's a similar thing where government power over the economy was increasing, which meant that individual freedoms were decreasing. And because of all this severe economic damage of all the destruction, this is going to persist for a while after the war is over. Alright, so let's go ahead, and now it's time for you to try to summarize, and I know this is a lot, and we didn't even go into deep detail on all the battles and a lot of the specifics of the war. We did a basic overview of the war, but I want you to try to summarize in 3 to 5 sentences in a paragraph what you learned about World War I today. So consider the big ideas, right? And don't write 5 sentences about super specific things that are, they are important but aren't going to help you remember the big ideas. What you want to think about is, why did the war start? Who was involved? What made it unique? How did it end? What happened to the countries involved? What were the impacts? So think of your essential questions and use that information to write your summary. Okay, I hope that this was helpful in helping you to sort of understand the things that lead up to the more well-known World War, which is World War II. And I hope that you enjoyed this set of notes, and I'll see you later. Bye!